Okay, welcome again. We're excited to have our last panel of the day. It's going to be just as good as the first two. So I thank you for staying and joining us for the full afternoon. My name is Jane Gelhausen, and I work for the Mayor Ballard, the mayor of our city, as his Director of International and Cultural Affairs. And I'll just explain a little bit about what we do. If you don't know, Mayor Ballard is very passionate about Indianapolis being an international global city. We want to welcome the world to Indianapolis. It is open for everyone who wants to come work, live, and raise a family in our community. We also want to make sure that everybody knows that Indianapolis is very connected to the world. We want to prepare our youth for the global economy. We want to educate and engage our traditional Hoosiers and let them know about how our organizations, such as business, our universities, arts, and sports, are very connected to the world. This is very important to the mayor. Indianapolis is very fortunate to have 14,000 Burmese in our city. They're just one of our many diverse ethnic groups. We are very proud to have them in our community. I hear over and over how excellent they are in terms of being employees in our companies. Their excellence as students in our high schools, with their gracious and very thoughtful nature, they're excellent at giving back to our community. We have several Burmese organizations here. BACI is one, but I wanted to also make you aware of the Chin Community Institute, which is on the south side. And if you don't know, annually we have a Chin National Day. It's typically held in February, and it's wonderful. Several thousands of individuals, Chin and our broader community, get together and celebrate Chin culture and food on that day. And they have a wrestling match as well. And also new, for me in particular, and probably for many of you, was really to learn about how IU is partnering with Burma. I really was not aware of this, but is definitely great work that this institution is doing. So as you can see, our city is very international. Our relationship with Burma is significant, and it's just one great example of our community connectedness, both here and abroad. So with that, I'm pleased to join today by this terrific set of panelists, two that you've met before, and we have one new one. I will have to say that David Williams was not able to join us this afternoon. His wife became ill, and so he was not able to join us for the panel today. We're going to discuss the topic of political and legal reform process, the current status and the future. We've talked several times now that the elections are coming up in November, and so this is an important year to reflect upon Myanmar's progress on its road to democracy. We're going to be covering political and constitutional reform processes, as well as peace negotiations in the country, and discussing how these different happenings might play out in 2015. So our returning panelists are Dr. Nicholas Ferrari, close enough, the fellow at Australian National University and the director of ANU-IU Pan-Asian Institute. Also Harn Yahweh is executive director of Euro-Burma Office in Myanmar. And our new panelist is Nagin Pao Gipkin. I'll give you a brief bio of Mr. Gipkin. He is originally from Myanmar in the Indo-Burma area. He is currently in Maryland. He got an MA from Ball State University, and his PhD for political science was obtained by the University in Hyderabad, India, where his dissertation was Democratic Transition in Myanmar, Patterns of Political Change. His general interest beyond democratic transition is in human rights, ethnic conflict, and foreign policy. He's written over 100 articles and has those published in 5 continents. Since Mr. Gipkin is a new panelist, I'd like to invite him to spend 5 to 10 minutes sharing a bit about yourself and the work you do in and about Myanmar.
Good afternoon, everyone. I was asked to talk about what I do. In fact, right now I'm looking for a job, so I do nothing. So if anyone out there looking to hire somebody, I'm available. Since this is the final panel, I want to talk about what's going on in the country, especially my specialization is in democratic transition. And before I begin that, I want to thank Nick. We have been emailing each other before, and we are working on the same area on issues of Burma. And also I want to thank Uhan. I interviewed him during my PhD field trip as a civil society leader in Rangoon, and finally we met here together in face-to-face. Today I want to talk about consensual transition. What does it mean? Where does Burma fit into? Consensual transition manifests in two ways. One is that when authoritarian leaders tolerate the change or tolerate the democratic change and refrain from active participation. That's one manifestation of consensual transition. And the second type of consensual transition is that authoritarian leaders are actively involving or participating in the democratic change by controlling or limiting the change. And in Burma, what we see today is the second part of consensual transition. So, which means that in the process of change, in democratic change, the leaders are part of the process. You can tell by looking at 2008 Constitution that 25% of legislature seats are still reserved for the military without any election. And if this continues to go without any, let's say, improvement, this kind of transition can also lead to what some people call incomplete democracy, or illiberal democracy, or semi-liberal democracy. So Burma is in the stage, there are several types of democratization process. One of them is gradual and incremental transition. And Burma is going that pattern, gradual and incremental transition. And I was asked to talk about the issue of ethnic minority in the country. So if we look at the country today, there are 8 major ethnic nationalities, including the Burmans, or Myanmar or Burma group. And if you look at, there are 7 other ethnic groups which are considered ethnic minorities. And if we look at the history of Burma, since before independence of the country, Burma proper and the frontier areas were ruled separately by the British. And before Burma was given or granted independence by the British, the Burman leader Aung San promised the frontier people that if the Burmans get 1 child, which means $1, the other groups also would get 1 child, which means there would be equality of treatment, equality of access to resources. But what happened after Aung San was assassinated, all these promises were forgotten. Then today we see, some people might say that economic problem might be the most important or the crucial element of this democratic transition. But as a political scientist, I see that the issue of ethnic minorities in the country is the most crucial and important element of how this country is going to go forward. It's going to be dependent upon whether the problem is solved. Let's say, the current national movement, for example, started in 1948, just 1 year after the country's independence. Then, originally, the demand was independent. But later, after a few years, not just the Karens, but the Kachins and others, they all demanded independence from the Union. But then they later realized that that was impossible. For some reason, they started bargaining on this federal structure, a federal government, which we are talking about today. And I see that there are two stages of democracy movement in the country. One for the Burman group, the Burma group, the other ones for ethnic minorities. What I mean by this is that, let's say, for example, the majority Burman groups would be I think, happy with democracy. But ethnic minorities, for them, democracy itself, by itself, is not sufficient. Therefore, they will have to fight another step again to gain what they call their own individual rights. For example, they have been fighting for a federal state, a federal structure, and we have heard this from the panels this morning that the government has, in principle, agreed to form a federal society in the country. But it's still to be seen whether that is going to be fulfilled or that's going to be a reality in 50 years from now. And we do not know who's going to be the next president, whether it's going to be Thein Sein or whether it's going to be Suleiman, or if God willing, whether Aung San Suu Kyi is going to be the next president. We don't know yet. But we can be sure about this. Until and unless the issues of ethnic minorities are peacefully resolved, I don't see there will be what we call a genuine democratic society in the country. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gipkin, for your opening comments there. Before we actually get into the panel conversation, Mr. Yahweh would like to make a brief presentation on peace negotiation. So
Thank you.
I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I won't talk very long on this matter because we discussed it this morning, but I wanted to show you slides so that you can understand the process better. And I have to say that I agree with Dr. Kipkin, because we lost democracy in Burma because of the ethnic issue. And until the ethnic issue is resolved, the army will never go back to the barracks. So it's very important that we resolve this matter. Yes, next slide, please. As I was saying, we are going through a transition, not a revolution. So don't be surprised that the generals are still there, the ex-generals are in government. That's how it is. Because I put this up because many of us get confused and say, it's not a transition. The generals are still there. They're still in power. No, it's not. It's a transition, and they're still there. Next one, please. When the peace talks started, it was very confusing. The government had two people in charge, and they dealt with different groups. And they were competing amongst themselves, giving different terms. Nobody knew what was the real peace plan. Then we had a change. Thank you. Next one. Then they form a peace committee and a work committee, and then they had the peace center set up to handle the different armed groups. Next one, please. So we tried to get the ethnic groups into one negotiating team, but it didn't quite succeed. We couldn't get everybody into the team. There are 5 groups that are not part of the team. That's part of the problem with the nationwide ceasefire agreement, because it was negotiated by the team representing the 16 groups down there, but not the 5 groups up there. And yeah. Anyway, just to say that it's very complicated. And then this is also, I wanted to talk about the achievements of the negotiations, because most people are very critical and suspicious of the government, and they don't see this negotiation as being real. But the government actually has changed quite a bit. They thought at first that it was an economic problem only. Now they accept that it's a political problem. They were only going to negotiate bilaterally. Now they agree to negotiating with all the groups together. They said that the armed groups must give up their arms. Now they say it's fine. And at first they thought they would just do development on their own. Now they realize that they need to consult before they have development projects. And they said you cannot change the 2008 constitution. You have to accept it. Now they say you can change it. So there's been a lot of, and joint control of the agenda. That's also another very important concession. And at first the government thought they would get peace right away. Everybody surrenders and everything's done. Now they know that it can't be done, and they accept that it will only come after a dialogue. And if you look at the top, that's what the government originally proposed, and now the blue one is what is now in place. there will be a political dialogue outside the parliament, and the changes will be done after the agreement. But we are running into a problem. As you can see, at first we thought we would have a long ceasefire process going on, start a political dialogue, have peace building. Peace building is making sure that the people benefit from the ceasefire agreements, and then you have elections. But now, the ceasefire took so long that everything is now squashed into 2015, and we are desperately racing against time. Next. Okay, so what have we done to try to make sure that we can get the dialogue started before the elections? The top part is how we originally thought it would take place, but as you can see, even if they signed the ceasefire agreement in June, there isn't enough time to start the dialogue. So we have, in May, as I mentioned earlier, started this process of discussing the framework so that when they sign the ceasefire, we can start the political dialogue right away. Next, please. And there's also confusion amongst everybody about whether it is the nationwide ceasefire agreement or the deed of commitment, which was signed in February, which is better. I just wanted to show you it's basically the same thing, except that in the nationwide ceasefire agreement, there are lots more military issues in it. And the problem with the nationwide ceasefire agreement is it has not been signed yet, and we don't know if it will be signed. So it was important to get the commitment from the government that they are committed to a federal democratic nation, they're committed to a nationwide ceasefire, they're committed to a political dialogue. And so the thing on the right is the deed of commitment that was signed, and that is what we are holding the government to. Next, please. Yeah, and this is just to show you what do we mean by a framework. We have, who will be part of it, what's the agenda, what issues will be discussed. These are the things that everybody needs to agree on, because we can't have one party, the government or the armed groups, dictating to the others. We want everybody to agree. This is how we want the dialogue to take place. Next, please. So some people are also saying there's no need to hurry for the nationwide ceasefire agreement, but we say it is necessary because without a nationwide ceasefire, as I mentioned this morning, the next government will have to negotiate everything all over again. If there's no agreed political framework, then the army or anybody else could change their mind and we might not have a dialogue. And even if the new government agreed, if the army disagreed, you would be in trouble again. So you need to fix everything before the elections. And without political dialogue, the armed groups would be in the same position as in the 90s. Many of them signed ceasefire agreements but never got a political dialogue. So we don't want to repeat that. And as I said, this is the first time in 68 years that any government has agreed to a federal democratic union. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yanwei. I am a very visual person, like probably many of you are, so that was very helpful to actually see how that process maybe works and the framework and all that is very involved. You can definitely tell there's a lot of complexity. It's not an easy thing to accomplish, but really is history in the making. So it's very exciting times. So building off of this morning's conversation, we discussed a few pathways to reform, and so we want to continue a little bit of that discussion. And the first question is for any of you or all of you. Do you feel that there are any particular stakeholders that should be included in the peace negotiations or the reform process that are currently being left out? And if they are being left out, is that because of a willing decision not to participate or because they have been excluded for some reason?
One of the problems with that framework, who will participate and how are they represented, is that, strangely enough, neither the political parties nor the ethnic armed groups want the participation of civil society. The government is the one insisting on civil society being part of the dialogue. So that's a very interesting dynamic. And one of the reasons for not including civil society is that the question is, who does civil society represent? Can they not have their representative within the party or within the armed group? So that's one of the dilemmas we face. The other thing is that the question of the Rohingya in western Burma, in Rakhine State, they are not recognized, and they're not recognized as citizens, and they're not recognized as a group. It's a very sensitive, it's a very controversial issue. And the only way they can be brought in, I would think, is that once the dialogue gets going and the issue of citizenship and who belongs to Myanmar comes up, then maybe they can be brought in. The population? So they could be bigger. Nobody really knows the they could be a million or so of them. And some of the ethnic groups, like the Chin, actually are less than that. Yeah.
I just want to add a few things here. I personally think that political parties should be invited in some way, somehow, somewhere in the process. Especially ethnic minority leaders are demanding that Aung San Suu Kyi should be part of the process. And so far, Wuhan would be the right person to answer this question, but I think at some point we need the involvement or the participation of political party leaders from different ethnic groups, including this National League for Democracy, which is headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, which is also proposed by ethnic armed groups. And the issue of the Rohingya group, my paper, which is going to be published by the Johns Hopkins Press, University Press in July, I was asked to write about why Rohingya should not be included in the peace process. And I said, very similar to what Wuhan just said, they are not included because it's very simple. They are not recognized as part of as a citizen of the country. Therefore, they have no platform. But I must stress that this cannot be continued for forever. It has to be resolved. There has to be a solution. So we cannot kick them away, all these people. They have to be somewhere, must be fixed. There has to be a solution. At some point, the Rohingya problem has to be resolved. Otherwise, we will not have any peaceful, stable, democratic society in Myanmar.
Thank you very much, Jane, for a terrific question. I'm just going to make two observations about representation and representativeness that I think haven't been touched on yet by the other panellists. So the first of those observations relates to Myanmar's many ethnic armed groups. Of course, they must play a central role in any of the ongoing negotiations, both with the central authorities, but also among themselves. We shouldn't, though, assume that ethnic armed groups are representative of ethnic interests. They don't have democratic mandates of their own, and in some cases, I think that the evidence that's built up over decades about their exploitation of their own populations suggests that we should be quite careful about assuming that ethnic armed groups and their current leaders are necessarily speaking for ethnic minorities themselves. Of course, this varies widely across the country, but given the history, given the difficulties of prosecuting their particular rebellions, there are all sorts of reasons to expect that certain leaders or certain groups at least wouldn't enjoy widespread support among those ethnicities with whom they share a name. The second observation about representativeness goes to the conundrum of the Rohingya. There's a peculiar aspect of this story that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and that's that at the 2008 constitutional referendum, and then again at the November 2010 general election, Rohingya voted in northern Rakhine State in very large numbers. At the 2010 election, we have some indication of who they voted for. The Union Solidarity and Development Party, that is the proxy party that spun out of the old military regime. This is important for lots of reasons, but I think though that the general point is that the Rohingya and other disenfranchised and vulnerable populations have been used and abused when convenient, and then of course discarded when their particular value to certain political interests has expired. The current representatives for the key townships with large Rohingya populations in northern Rakhine State sit in the legislatures in Naypyidaw. They are Muslims, they are Rohingya representatives, at least to an extent, but they also carry the flag of the USDP, which of course emerged from the old military regime. So with these sorts of complexities in the story of representation, I think it will take quite a long time before we can be confident that those who appear to speak on behalf of the people actually do so.
All right.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I agree with Nicholas, but the same applies to the USDP and the political parties. Do they really represent the people?
We talked a lot about the military and the role that they have. So I have a two-part question here. What role do you foresee the military playing, not only this year with the elections, but for the foreseeable future? And also, do they really have any willingness to relinquish their future power and divest themselves of such sway in Parliament and other aspects of Myanmar life?
Are they willing to relinquish power? I don't think so. But what happened, I just said before that there are different types of democratization process, and Burma is going through gradual and incremental democratization process, and something similar to what we had seen in Indonesia. Along the road, what would happen is, I think right now the military, by the way, I got a chance to sit down with General King Yew, who was the Prime Minister for quite some time during the military regime, during my field trip. And he is also in favor of having a federal government, which is typical of Burmese way of federal society. And what I say is that eventually the Burmese military would consider, if not, they would consider giving up absolute power, but under the condition that their security, their personal security are safeguarded and protected some way, somehow by the constitution or something. Unless they see that kind of personal safety or security for themselves and for their family members, I do not see in the near future that military would be willing to relinquish power. But they would also at the same time realize that without them giving up power, Burma cannot achieve a true and peaceful democratic society.
First of all, with the upcoming elections, I don't think the military will do anything. They are in favor of this free and fair election that is going on. In terms of changing the constitution, I'm not defending the military, I'm not a friend of the military, but you have to accept that they initiated the change. They went from 100% in power to 25% in parliament. That is a huge change, really. And they have said, this was mentioned publicly a couple of weeks ago by the Minister of Information, who's the spokesperson for the president, that the military is willing to change the constitution. The thing they don't want is they don't want the constitution to be changed without their participation. And the 25% is a safety net for them. Why do they need a safety net? Unfortunately, after the 1990 elections, when the NLD won a landslide, some leaders mentioned that they would put the generals on trial. And that is something that the military generals are very afraid of. They don't want that to happen. And secondly, they want to make sure that if you change the constitution, it doesn't get them into trouble. So that's why they are there. So I think they will change in time, because the leadership of the army today is better educated and younger, and they do see the need for reform within the military. It's been an interesting experience to talk to them and to watch them. So I think the U.S. military-to-military engagement is something that would help.
As I said this morning, I've been spending a fair bit of time these recent years in Naypyidaw, Myanmar's astonishing, grandiose, and in certain respects at least, utterly unprecedented and unique new capital city. I'll let you all in on a little secret. My very most favourite place in Naypyidaw is the Defence Services Museum. And I would encourage any of you who ever have an opportunity to see it for yourself. It is an unbelievable showcase of everything that is important to Myanmar's former military rulers and their successors when it comes to the central place of the armed forces in the country's past, present and future. The Defence Services Museum probably, and again, I don't know Indianapolis well, but probably has the equivalent floor space of all of your museums and galleries put together, okay? Right, it is an unbelievable investment. It took them a couple of years to build it, and then it was filled with all of the toys and trinkets that have been accumulated by Myanmar's armed forces over the decades. Some of the directorates, some of the brigades, some of the battalions have done a simply superb job of telling us how it is that they work, how they think, what they're trying to do. And the only conclusion that I can draw from this museum, a museum, I should emphasise, that almost no Myanmar citizens ever visit, okay, right? Like quite literally, this is the biggest museum you could imagine, but there's nobody who bothers to show up. The board, usually relatively junior Myanmar soldiers, sailors and airmen who are expected to show rare guests around, are always delighted to give you a bit of a sense of their lives and careers and everything that's gone with the construction of this particular edifice. But if we were looking for a lesson to take away from that particular complex, it's that the armed forces see themselves as the foundation, the building block, the centre of everything that is great and glorious about the country. That hasn't changed just because we are in this current moment of constitutional and political and economic transformation. I'd suggest that the armed forces is right now going about the business of rethinking some of its roles. I think we heard earlier today that the intention on the Myanmar government side is to ramp up engagement with foreign militaries. I'd expect that if the 2015 election goes according to plan, then we'll see a great deal more of that, and it's likely to mean that the Myanmar Armed Forces, all being well, will be a very different institution in a decade or two's time.
I'm not sure if this next question is, it definitely alludes to what you just mentioned, but it probably is beyond just foreign militaries. But looking beyond the stakeholders within Myanmar, is there a role that other countries in the region and around the world can play to hold Myanmar accountable and help drive government toward internationally acceptable reforms?
Yeah, I think we've all got to be careful about just how much pressure we think that countries outside Myanmar can exert. to my ears at least, this has been something of a theme throughout today's discussion. Myanmar will, to a great extent at least, continue to manage its affairs on its own terms. When I hear grand external visions for what Myanmar should become, I tend to be quite wary. I'm wary because I know that in my own conversations with Myanmar decision makers, it's usually pretty hard to persuade them. And so for any large-scale effort from the outside to really shift thinking would require some quite unexpected and perhaps unusual conditions. I think, though, we've already had an opportunity during the past decade for international pressure to be mobilised in new and useful ways, and that was in the aftermath of the devastation of Cyclone Nargis back in May of 2008. And that's not an event that's been given a great deal of attention in the last couple of years, but to my mind at least, it was the time when a lot of new international efforts and initiatives could get traction and then perhaps help to catalyse some of the flow-on effects inside Myanmar itself.
I want to add a few things here. In my PhD dissertation, I was looking at the role of international community or external agencies. And I studied or I analyzed sanctions versus engagement, the Western sanctions and neighboring country, especially ASEAN engagement. I was looking, after analyzing documents and several other things, sources, I came to a conclusion that neither sanctions, engagements were the triggering factor for democratic change in Myanmar. And that was one of the reasons why I went all the way to Rangoon, from Rangoon to outskirts of Rangoon to meet the former Prime Minister King Yew, because he was the one who introduced the 7-step roadmap process. I tried to meet him 4 times. I was successful only after 4 attempts. And I specifically asked him this question. And we have to know that the military has its own plan. Still, the process is as a follow-up or as a continuation of 7-step roadmap process that was introduced in 2003 by the former Prime Minister General King Yew. Therefore, I do not foresee that even though there might be pressure or external pressure from the international community, that would have a bigger or a huge impact in terms of domestic politics in the country. The military would do or would change things when they see things are good for them.
I have to agree with both speakers. I spent 25 years of my life trying to pressure the government, lobbying for all sorts of governments, UN, everybody. And I think we were pretty successful, because when we started, nobody knew where Burma was or what it was. Usually they said, is it Bahamas? So, now we have everybody knowing about Burma, so we were very successful. But, as has been said, we couldn't pressure the military. Changes came about only when they wanted it, according to their own timetable, according to their own agenda. And what we're trying to do now is trying to help them move along faster.
Okay. Dr. Fairley, this next question is for you. You spent much of this last year conducting research in Naypyidaw. This is the capital. This capital now of Myanmar is known for being an isolated, ghost town-esque capital city. Given its reputation being far removed from the people of the country, to what extent do you feel that the government official and representatives were trying to remain connected to the populace?
Thanks, Jane. Great question. I could literally talk about Naypyidaw all afternoon, all evening, and late into the night, but let me just keep this really brief. And I hope by offering a few quick observations about Naypyidaw that the place doesn't seem so abstract or purposeless. The fact is, Naypyidaw was built with a purpose. One of those purposes was to escape Yangon. Yangon, as many of you appreciate, is the old colonial capital. It's also increasingly cluttered, a bit run down. It has a deficit of modern high-tech infrastructure. And when the old military regime was imagining how they could recenter the political order, it made sense to make a gargantuan investment in a new capital city. Naypyidaw, in its early phase, may also have served some broader strategic purpose. Of course, there's been an assertion, at least over the years, that it was judged easier to defend. Naypyidaw is some 5 hours from the nearest coastal access. It's also wedged in a valley and with high mountains surrounding its backwards approaches. It's also, because it's so different to Yangon, the kind of place that can be relatively easily locked down in a contingency. And some people, of course, explain that various of Naypyidaw's major compounds are places like the Union Assembly facility, certain of the ministries, certain of the residences of high-profile decision-makers are also able to be locked down or perhaps cut off if that was judged to be useful. Naypyidaw, to my mind at least, has in its DNA, in its concrete, its manicured grass, its incredibly large roadways, its gigantic oversized airport, its ludicrous train station. In all of that, it has something which speaks to a great desire to do something unusual, something which speaks to the grandest traditions of Myanmar society and politics. There have been many new capitals over the long run of Myanmar history. I once did the maths, and it looks like the average life expectancy of a Myanmar capital city is 52 years. Okay, so this is year number 10 for Naypyidaw. We'll have to wait and see whether it hits the historical average. My best guess, though, is that Naypyidaw will probably survive, even though for a period the National League for Democracy was perhaps wondering about what it would take, what it would cost to abandon the new city. Now that Daw Aung San Suu Kyi and some of her key strategists have got to know Naypyidaw, my impression from a distance is that they've also come to terms with what the new city might mean. I've already encouraged you this afternoon, if you ever have a chance to go to the Defence Services Museum, this is a recommendation that can spread to the rest of the city. You won't regret it, because I think if you want to understand what's going on right at the heart of this process of quite unparalleled transformation, then Naypyidaw is the place to be.
I just want to add one to Nick's comment. Last time when I visited Naypyidaw, I was invited inside the chamber of the vice president of USDP, the ruling party. He is the deputy in chief of President Thein Sein's party. And I didn't ask him specifically, but I don't know, for some reason, he started talking about the reason why they shifted the capital from Rangoon to Naypyidaw. What he said was, according to him, this was a plan for the past many years. And what they did was, if you go to every state or regions, they had their own state legislatures. And the same applies to Rangoon. And therefore, the government wanted to have a separate and independent or free from any interference from the state legislatures or the division or region legislatures. They want to build a place where the government or the federal government has its own unique and independent and free from other locations. That was the reason why the government chose to build Naypyidaw. I don't know whether it's true or not, but that's the government side of the interpretation.
Quick one. The other reason is that there are no people in Naypyidaw, they don't demonstrate. All the demonstrations happen elsewhere. And all the ministers actually come to Yangon every weekend.
Okay, we talked already about the Rohingyas, but I didn't know if there was anything else we wanted to say related to Myanmar's and the government having possible resolutions to give them citizenship and safety. The Rohingyas.
It's quite complicated because the general impression is that the Rohingya don't belong to Burma. They've come from Bangladesh, and that's what. But actually, if you look at history, the kingdom of Rakhine extended to India. So and Rakhine became part of Burma only in the 18th or 19th century. So if you go back, it's very hard to actually, but there's a general resentment against the Rohingya because most Burmese nationalists feel that the Indians, Bangladeshi, Pakistan, everyone, came with the British, and they were the ones who supported the British against the Burmese king. So that's the general background. So there is that resentment and unacceptance. But really, at independence, it was said that anybody within the boundaries of Myanmar are citizens. So if you go by that, they are citizens. But there's a claim that there's been recent migration coming from, but I think the majority of them have been there for generations. And then the complication is that in 1982, the Ne Win government changed the citizenship law, saying that they have to prove that they have been in Myanmar for 3 generations. Well, a lot of people in Myanmar have no documents. So how do you prove you've been there 3 generations? But the interesting thing is that they gave them, they were going to change the national registration cards. So they gave them temporary national registration cards, which are known as the white cards. Giving them temporary registration means that they are citizens. They have just been given temporary for a couple of weeks before the real cards are issued. But the problem is they never issued them with the real cards, and they've been holding these temporary cards for decades. And that complicates the whole issue. But because they are citizens, that's why they could vote. That's why they voted in the referendum, and that's why they voted in the elections. So in that sense, it's quite clear. But nobody wants to accept that, and if I were to say this in Myanmar, I would probably be attacked about supporting the Rohingya.
Yeah, I might also say something now that won't make me any friends in certain quarters in Myanmar. While much of my work focuses on other parts of the country, I do occasionally make it up to northern Rakhine State, and also occasionally spend time in Bangladesh, particularly down along the border with Myanmar. I wouldn't pretend to have full appreciation for the profound complexities of this situation, but I'd just like to offer you some of my quick, perhaps even amateurish appraisals of the situation as it faces Rohingya in northern Rakhine State. I've done research in my time in places where things can be pretty nasty. There is spite and all sorts of local level antagonism, but I've never spent time in a place which is quite as difficult as northern Rakhine State. The level of grievance and hatred is difficult to exaggerate, and after the violence, which many of you will recall spiraled out of control in 2012, I made a particularly memorable but also disheartening visit to northern Rakhine State when people were, to my ears at least, outrageously proud of their contributions to the violence that occurred. And much of that pride was on the Rakhine Buddhist side of the equation. And the only, I think, reasonable comparison that I can offer to give you some sense of just how intolerable certain of these views are is to perhaps Imagine for a moment the sorts of rhetoric and viciousness that would circulate in parts of Central Europe during the rise of Nazism. It was particularly difficult for me and some of those that I was with to be having to constantly confront the particularly egregious violations that people would be quite happy to embrace. The burned out neighbourhoods of Sittwe are still there today. Nobody's lifted a finger to fix them. And perhaps that's where one contrast with Bangladesh is worth pointing out. In 2012, there was anti-Buddhist violence in some of the borderlands areas of southeastern Bangladesh. Large numbers of Buddhist sites were destroyed, some of which were many hundreds of years old. Buddhist neighbourhoods were also burned out by large Muslim mobs. The difference is that in Bangladesh, for its own political reasons, the government and its security forces went about rebuilding the Buddhist sites and the Buddhist neighbourhoods. That hasn't happened in Myanmar, and I would expect, given the current tone of discussion inside the country about the Rohingya, but also about other Muslims, that we'll be waiting quite a long time before there is a re-embrace of the pluralism that should be at the heart of Myanmar's multicultural success.
Well, we would like to now open the floor to any questions from the audience. And also, I've been encouraged that if anybody would like to ask a question in Burmese, you can do that as well.
I have 2 points in this discussion. Number one, we talk about Burma change, we talk about democracy, and then as my 2 ethnic friends, panelists mentioned, ethnic minority issue or federalism, yes. Democracy then plus federalism, yes. And then the whole day we talk about business. As my colleague Han said, without peace, you can do business. I agree that. But finally, my conclusion is that if there's a military, you can't do anything. Neither democracy nor federalism nor business. So military. Okay, when it's come to military, the panelists mentioned about the museum, the great museum. I'm very interested to put. But for me, I just want to pinpoint not the whole military, one person, Tan Sri. My theory, I have had that theory for maybe 5 years ago, but my theory still is true, is that when the time changes took place in Burma, it's coincided with the Arab Spring and fall of those guys. You know, I'm talking about Tan Sri. His predecessors, his 2 previous bosses, General Ne Win and Senior General Somo, how did they die? In the funeral of Ne Win, only 6 persons were present. Tan Sri's close boss, Senior General Somo, he died of nervous breakdown. So as a human, Tan Sri does not want to die like his 2 bosses. So he made a plan. His plan comes about 7-point roadmap, the 2008 Constitution, so-and-so this parliament, so-and-so things, 25%. That is for his grand funeral. Only one purpose of one person. As long as Tan Sri is alive, you can't expect any change. This is one point. Number 2 one is about, you talk about Rohingyas. I will say it is a war for a name. A name means Rohingya, not for Muslims, not for both peoples, not for those Muslims in Arakan state. It is for Rohingya name. If I say Rohingya in Burma, I can be a criminal. I must see Bengali. If I am not talking about Rohingya outside Burma, I will be awkward Burmese. Democrat. This is a war for a name. There have been a lot of battles. They have won many battles. I mean, those who are fighting for a name, Rohingya, not for Muslim. We are talking about boat people. You think about the people on those boats in Bay of Bengal. They paid for boat right. They are not the person on the rescue vehicles. They paid for that right, boat right. So it's not talking about human rights or minority rights or citizenship right. You know, in a country, according to CIA and government figure, 89% worship or believe in Buddhism. But why in this OIC wants to build open office in that country? In the history of the war, no country was pressured to allow citizenship to those people. I don't see any country, 86, citizenship law to amended by America, UN or EU or whatever country. I don't see any country which was asked for or pressure to change or to amend those citizenship law of a single country. So my conclusion is, it is a war just for a name. Thank you.
I want to give further comments regarding Tan Sui and the changes what has occurred. If we look at theoretical backgrounds or literatures, there are, broadly speaking, there are 3 stages of democratization process. The first one, and the beginning is, we just call it democratization. In that stage, for example, civil societies are formed, political parties are formed, and society started changing, moving toward democratic society. We call it the first stage. And the second stage is democratic transition. The transition itself, which means changes from one form of government to another form of government, from authoritarian regime to democracy, from military junta to a democratic society. That transition is second stage. And the third and final stage is consolidation of democracy. And we don't know for how many years it's going to take Burma to get to consolidated democracy yet. And Burma, I would say that still it's in the very early stage of the second stage of those 3 stages, which means democratic transition, and it's in the beginning stage of that second stage. What I'm trying to say is that, of course, I still believe that Tan Sui has influence in the current, whatever the peace process or the democratic reform process. But we have to agree the fact that there has been change in the country. And we have to agree that there was no parliament before. Of course, we can still argue that it's not that very fair and very legitimate, or let's say it's not a fully functional or democratic legislature. But we have to agree that there has been a change. There was no parliament for many, many years under the military regime, successive military governments. And since 2010 election and 2011 formation of parliament, we see some changes. We call it, that's why we have to understand the different steps or different stages of democratization process. Within even that stages, we have the sub-stages of changes. Therefore, we have to agree the fact that there has been change in Burma, but the pace of the change has been slow, maybe for some people, but I still believe that Tan Sui somewhere still has some kind of influence in the process.
I don't think I can change Dr. Tan Sui's ideas. But yes, in the beginning, I think Tan Sui may have agreed to this transition based on his own safety. But things have changed beyond what he expected. The current government has to be careful that they don't upset him, but he has no day-to-day influence. I'm quite certain about that. And the changes have really, like was mentioned by the ambassador, it is irreversible because people have, there's no way they would go back to the old system. They will not accept it. Because one of the things that shocked me was that at one point I was being followed by these special branch of security people. And I had checked into a hotel, and it's quite a big hotel, and my friend was waiting for me, and I went up to my room. And this special branch guy went to the receptionist and said, "What's his room number?" And she said, "I'm sorry, I can't tell you." To me, that speaks volumes, because in the old days, she would have been thrown to prison for refusing to cooperate with the secret police. You know, so it's the ornery people who are no longer afraid, and they are no longer going to accept. I've heard of cases where government officials have, normally you have to bribe officials for everything, and where people have refused to pay the bribe and held them accountable. This is your job. This is democracy. We can't pay you. So things are beginning to change, and I think that is what is very hopeful. And the young people really would never accept going back under military rule. So I think that's one thing I wanted to say. And in terms of the Rohingya, yes, there are people who are fighting for a name, but I don't think that is the issue in Myanmar. Most of the people in northern Rakhine couldn't care whatever you call them. They don't even, but the conditions they live under, and the communal violence, the hatred, as was mentioned earlier, is really quite scary. And the thing people forget, Myanmar people forget, that history has been changed, and the Muslims, the other people, are seen as foreigners. But one of the martyrs that was killed with Aung San was a Muslim. They were all part of the movement. It was very multicultural. So I think, as Nicholas said, we need to go back to that the acceptance of the diversity of the country.
I think I may already have said far too much on the topic of the Rohingya, but let me chance my arm once more and perhaps provide something of a rebuttal to the suggestion that what we're dealing with here is merely a battle about the use of one particular word, the R word. It's become a point of great friction in Myanmar society, but as Ji's just indicated, it doesn't go to the heart of this particular issue. And I very much doubt that those who are struggling, either as displaced people in northern Rakhine State, or as those who still fear that their neighbourhoods and villages will be attacked, or among the, say, 500,000 Rohingya or people like them who live in camps and other informal settlements in southeastern Bangladesh, or those who then get together enough money to take to boats, perhaps seeking safer or more prosperous shores somewhere else. I doubt that for any of them this comes down to a question of the name that they are called. It's about access to a secure livelihood. It's about a sense of belonging. It's about the basic human requirement for safety and security. That's the security to practice your religion, the confidence in raising your children within their own culture. All of that has step by step been stripped from many of those people who we have come to know of as Rohingya. I think that if the name means anything, and if the battle about its use is worthwhile, it's that this is now a name through which we have come to appreciate so many of these difficult circumstances. And for that reason, at least, it strikes me as being a useful contribution to our respective languages. And I hope that at some stage, Rohingya might come to mean something else, perhaps will come to mean are people who have gone through these fires, come out harder and better and stronger, and then found for themselves some way to live in peace with their neighbours.
Okay. I thought of skipping this issue, but it came to my mind that I was asked the same question while I was giving a lecture in India, New Delhi. My response in brief was that if the majority of the Burman groups in the country, or let's say other people in the country, are hesitant to accept the name Rohingya, what about coming up an alternative name which is mutually acceptable to both sides, both the Rohingyas and the Burmans or other ethnic groups of the country? Let's say if the word R is restricted or prohibited in the country, we might be able to suggest mutually acceptable another name. That could be also considered.
I just want to say that it is the right of every people to decide what they want to be called. For example, the government of Myanmar insists that there's no such thing as Burma, there's only Myanmar. That happened only how many years ago? Not very.
89.
Yeah, so you have the right to change your name, whatever you want.
Okay, we have another question.
Concerning about peace process between the government and the armed groups. Now in Burma, we have two governments. One is a Thein Sein government. He appointed some cabinet members, and another one is General Min Aung Hlaing. He appointed the most important cabinet. So we have now in Burma, we have two governments. Now Thein Sein government said they are ready for sign the peace agreement, but still Min Aung Hlaing government is still silent. Even they reach an agreement between the government and armed groups, do you think can Min Aung Hlaing accepted the result of the peace agreement? And if Min Aung Hlaing reject that agreement between the government and the armed groups, what can be happen in Burma? Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, under the Constitution, the president is in charge of the country and he is in charge of political issues. Min Aung Hlaing is the commander-in-chief and he's in charge of security. And the only way he can go against the president is if he can show that what the president is doing is against the security of the nation. And he has not done that. He has gone along. His three lieutenant generals were part of the negotiating team to get the nationwide ceasefire agreement. And he has supported the political dialogue idea. He has also supported the idea of a federal union. So I think things have changed quite a bit. And there isn't two governments. It's just that Min Aung Hlaing appointed a number of ministers who have to serve under the president.
Is he walking up are you walking up for a question? Okay.
So I have two questions. The first concerns a group on the other end of the country, namely the WA, and what the WA demands at the recent conference in Pangshang Bode for the future of the peace process, given that they seem to me to have demanded de facto independence from Myanmar. That's number one. Number two concerns the command and control structure of the Tatmadaw. Whatever is finally agreed to, whatever code of conduct is finally agreed to, what confidence can ethnic armed groups have that the local commanders, the division level commanders, the battalion commanders of the Tatmadaw are going to follow this code of conduct? Thanks.
Okay. First of all, the WA. They actually don't want to be part of China because they would be swallowed up. They don't want to be independent because, again, they'll be swallowed up. So they really want to be part of Myanmar. And they enjoy autonomy, as you have said. So basically what they're trying to do is to legalize their status so that they're not just seen as this autonomous body, but they're recognized as a separate state. That is not really a problem if they are asking for a Wa state according to the old demarcation. Wa state used to be separate from Shan state. They became part of Shan state only at independence. That would be no problem if they went back to that. The problem is that during the 80s and 90s, Kin Yun had said to the Was, if you want more territory, go and get it from the Shan. So they have fought and seized quite a large area in the Shan state. Now, if they want that area that they seized to become part of Wa state, you have a big problem. So that's the issue that would have to be discussed in the future. As for the Thermidor, actually, people say the ceasefires are useless, fighting is still continuing, and this and that. But if you really look at where the ceasefires have been signed and where the fighting is currently taking place, the ceasefires that have been signed have held. In general, they have no major clashes. There are some fighting, some clashes because both sides still have arms. So the command structure of the Thermidor does respect that. But when it is an area where there is no ceasefire and where the Thermidor will not give ground. If they are attacked, they will fight, and if they have to fight, they will use firepower and try to crush the other side. So that's the problem. But so most of the focus has been on the fighting without really looking where the fighting is taking place and whether the ceasefires are holding.
Just quickly, as something of a follow-up to Hans' comments on the way that command and control perhaps influences the maintenance of ceasefires and other agreements towards non-aggression. In an earlier incarnation, I spent a lot of time trying to get my head around how it is that the Kachin ceasefire was maintained. That is the ceasefire that held from 1994 through until the 9th of June 2011 between the Kachin Independence Army and the Myanmar Armed Forces, but in particular, Northern Command based in Myitkyina. And one of my impressions, at least, after having sought to understand the ceasefire and the various haphazard ways that it was welded together, particularly as Sayaji has suggested, with its grounding in the period when General Kin Yun was running the military intelligence apparatus, the breakdown of such ceasefires, and here the KIA agreement is perhaps the key example, suggests that once things are spiralling out of control, even in this day and age when communications are relatively free and easy, there's all sorts of ways for Naypyidaw and other central nodes of command responsibility to know about what's going on. There can still be aspects of a reignited conflict that don't get immediate attention and then that take on extra phases of escalation just because that has been the habit not of decades but of lifetimes. And I suppose I wonder how it is that will change, how it is that regional commands will come to a new understanding of their role. They would need almost to see themselves and their use of any armed force as the absolute last resort, and that doesn't appear to be the case. And I guess that, again, comes back to a command issue. And if the sorts of agreements that have been discussed here today are going to have any chance of being sustained for years and decades, then I'd guess that a new mentality within the high command, but also right out at the platoon level, would be required.
I just also wanted to add that you will continue to have human rights abuses as long as the military is not reformed, because that's their standard operating procedure.
Okay, let's have one last question.
Thank you, Jean. My question is to what? Comrade Han. According to 2008 Constitution or Nargis Constitution of Burma, in Article 16, it's mentioned that the president, right now, Wu Ting Sing is the head of the state. It's apparently okay. But in the next article, Article 20C, it's mentioned that the Commander-in-Chief, right now, Min Aung Hlaing is the chief of all the armed groups. So it seems like I want to agree Xiazeping's word that we have apparently two governments right now, and we don't know which one is more powerful. And again, in Article 159, it mentioned that the military expenditure budget cannot be discussed in Parliament. So that is totally totally against the democratic constitution. So, yeah, I'll go to my question, two questions. To amend or to rebuild the constitution is a must. And the main problem is Article 436. 25%, more than 75% approval needed to amend constitution. And we need to keep in mind that 25% army officers are there. That means you never change you never amend the constitution. So my question is, do you see any possibility that we can amend the constitution? And my second question is NCA, Nationwide Cease Agreement. After nationwide ceasefire agreement, the main theme, the main aim is political dialogue to have the new constitution or to establish federal democratic union. So do you see see, NCA, as you mentioned, you hope that NCA will be signed in August. Do you hope that political dialogue be started soon after NCA is signed? Thank you.
Thank you. As we said earlier, Myanmar is not yet a democracy. It is in transition. So the Constitution has all these articles that give the military an upper hand. But as I mentioned, if the military wants to disobey the president, they really have to show that it is a threat to national security. They cannot. And the other thing that is preventing the military from actually doing anything, Min Aung Hlaing from really going against the president, is that he, in terms of the military hierarchy, seniority, he's very junior compared to Thein Sein. Given the military kind of thinking, he would never go against a senior general that he has served under. So that's one good thing. And if I remember correctly, the military budget was submitted to Parliament. So there are changes taking place in spite of all the constitutional prohibitions or whatever you want to call them. And thirdly, I would say that will the political dialogue happen before the elections? I don't hope. I'm trying to make it happen. Thank you.
Okay. With that, I think we'll go ahead and actually just have one last question here that I'm going to ask for a very short answer. I think many of us walked in the room today probably not knowing so much about Burma, and now walking out of the room, feeling like we are very, maybe not experts on it, but we certainly can articulate what's happening with government, the election, trade. So we've learned quite a bit about what is going on in Myanmar and the future of Myanmar. So we're going to talk to our friends and our family and our colleagues as they say, hey, you went to this conference, what was it about? What's the future of Myanmar? So that's my question for you to sum up in 30 seconds or so. Give us your final take on the future of Myanmar.
Okay. I should say that I'm optimistic about the democratization process in the country. And like I said in the beginning, so there are several stages of democratization process, and Burma is going through the second stage of those stages. We are still in the beginning of the democratic transition period. Therefore, the success of building or achieving a fully or a genuine democratic society in the country would depend on the participation, then the cooperation, and the compromises of different political stakeholders, which means the ethnic nationalities, the army, and the executive branch, which people in the Thein Sein government. And also, those initiatives should be supported by the international community, including the government of the United States of America.
I would say that after 50 years of military rule, we have a bit of space, a bit of breathing space, a bit of space to exert our rights. And as long as we can defend that space and keep expanding it, we're on the right track, and we will probably see peace and democracy in the future.
For the past hour, you'll all appreciate that I've been somewhat grim, even grave, in a number of my statements. I'm going to end on a profoundly upbeat note. I don't need to tell the Myanmar people in the room that many people, tens of millions of people, in fact, in Myanmar, love to read. There are bookshops everywhere, journals, newspapers. It's a very literate society where learning is greatly valued. Yet until 2012, those tens of millions of Myanmar readers had never had access to an uncensored newspaper. That's changed in the blink of an eye. And it's not just that there's uncensored news of all varieties. There are dozens of daily newspapers. There's journals for every whim and fancy. There's also the internet. Now unblocked, unrestricted, it is mayhem, but the best kind of mayhem. So people who'd never read an uncensored newspaper now have access to a Twitter feed, to a Facebook newsreel with everything under the sun, intruding into their lives with intensity and velocity, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. I think the creative power of those new technologies and the new openness in Myanmar will be exciting and wondrous, and I think with that we should wish the Myanmar people the very, very best. Great.
Well, thank you very much. We were last, but not least, I certainly think. And we've had some great conversation and discussion here related to the elections and the future. So let's give our panel a big round of applause. So to wrap up today, we're going to have some concluding remarks by Elijah. And there's a little bit of time to do some networking and meet some other colleagues and friends before you depart for the evening. So thank you very much for coming out today.